Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first edition of our UXDX Online series for 2023. I'm really excited that we're kicking it off again. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you tonight. And so I hope you're as excited as we are for presenting tonight. So before we jump into the talks, I want to give a very quick introduction to what it is that we're doing at UXDX and why we run these sessions. So at UXDX, our mission is to help teams move from building software through projects to working as empowered autonomous product teams. And we believe, and that's our mission, because we believe that that's the most effective, efficient, and sustainable way of working in a high change environment, because it allows teams to really understand what their customers are needing and innovate to be able to solve the problems that they're facing. And that's kind of really easy thing to say, but it's hard to do in practice. It's like, oh, we'll just walk from projects to products. But that's why we invite people to talk and share their stories about how they're changing bits and pieces of how they're working, so that you can kind of see how you could maybe adjust things that you're doing in your workplace so that you can improve or maybe build those products that you're dreaming of. Now, what likely happen, and we hope happens, is that you'll have some questions as we go. And that's great. So what we'll do at the end of each of the talks is we'll save some time so that we can ask those questions to the speakers. So please feel free either to post them in the chat on the UXDX website, or if you're watching on YouTube or whatever channel you're watching through, and we'll be monitoring those so that we can answer those questions for you. The last thing, sometimes we do run out of time for the questions, and that's why we have our UXDX community Slack group. And in there's a channel called Ask the Speakers. So any questions that we don't get time to get through today, we'll put them in there and we'll invite the speakers to come and answer those questions for you. So that's enough about me. You're not here to listen to me talking. So what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker for the evening. And it is Esra, Gokgoz, which I've probably pronounced it incorrectly, so apologies for that, who is the principal designer for data and AI at Microsoft, and she'll be talking about AI for the real world. And so creating considered products through research and design. So welcome, Esra.
Hi everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be with you and to talk to you about designing thoughtful, considered AI products by using research and design. So a little bit about me. My background is in design, but I prefer to think of my work in these sort of themes that you see here. So I've always worked in what I would call a more sort of strategic capacity, a strategic design role, as it were. And I always also tried to do that at the kind of early stages. So early stage ventures, early stage kind of initiatives, to work with some of that ambiguity and to bring some of the tool kits, mindsets, all kinds of designerly things before potentially any actual design activities even taking place. And I've had the joy of doing that in a number of design and innovation practices at BCG, at Salesforce, and now at Microsoft. So at Microsoft, I'm part of the Data and AI organization, and we're a customer-facing part of the organization. So we work with Microsoft customers on their biggest data and AI challenges, and we do that across all sorts of industries, all sorts of different problems. So anything from, say, detecting defects in manufacturing to helping forecast or predict demand for retail. So some of the stuff that I'll be sharing with you today is going to be a kind of cross-section from that very broad experience, and again, from those very early stages of working through these potential products or potential services. So I don't know if some of you maybe already work with AI products or have at least implemented AI features. Maybe you have that direct experience, but regardless, I think that the narrative on AI is not always particularly helpful, right? There's a whole lot of, headlines telling us either that it's going to solve all our problems or create the worst problems of all. And you might actually start to think that maybe it's a little bit of a buzzword. I think that's also certainly true in certain contexts that it's used. But I think at the very least, it starts to maybe feel like a little bit of a magic well, just magic actually, or like a bit of a black box, maybe something that only people with a particular kind of expertise get to, you know, play a part in or actually define. And that's not really true, in my opinion, at least. So like any technology, its value is in its use and its context. Yes, it is technically complex to develop and deploy AI solutions. I never want to discount from that. But also, it's not just a technical problem, right? In a lot of the kind of work that we do in this enterprise context, it's helping people, for instance, correctly manufacture, you know, really sensitive electronic equipment, or to make medical interventions. And especially in those contexts where the stakes are high and there's a lot of embedded expertise also in that context, it's really important that we create things that are fit for purpose and that we design things for the real world with all of its kind of complexities and all of its contradictions and nuances. And for me, the best way to do that is through research and design. And when we think about the role of research and design in this context, it goes far beyond just thinking about usability or a great experience. As someone who's always championed this, I think this is always true, regardless of whether you're working with AI or not. But again, when the stakes are so high, and because of the nature of AI systems, we have to kind of fundamentally consider what design does in this context. And there's characteristics of AI systems basically that require that. So they're not deterministic. They adapt over time. We don't explicitly always tell them what to do. And thus we can't always predict exactly how they'll behave in different conditions, for instance. And they also have a lot of autonomy. So for the most part, we use them, we kind of delegate our reasoning or our decision-making to these systems or these features. And all of these combined mean that it can be a little bit opaque and also actually can fail in certain circumstances, and that can be difficult to anticipate. And all of that creates a very different landscape for research and design. So my team that I'm on is called the Human AI Experience team. And at first that might just seem like, you know, fancy language, a different way to say UX, but it's not, I promise you. It's actually due to the nature, this fundamentally different nature of working with AI systems. So if we think about users, that word starts to mean something very different when we think about what AI can do for us. Quite often, it's actually fundamentally reimagining that relationship. So if we take something like autonomous vehicles, in that context, who even is the user anymore, right? There's a driver that's not really driving. So it starts to really shift that idea. Maybe we also then actually have to consider more the, say, pedestrian that's crossing the street, the neighborhood that this vehicle is passing through, the city, what it means for the transport system, what it means for this wider ecosystem of actors, say, I don't know, insurance companies or mechanics, and maybe even actors or forces that don't necessarily have a human voice, like, say, the environment. So in this kind of context where we fundamentally are reimagining the relationships between these things, it kind of almost becomes redundant to think about design as working between the user and the technology. It's like a very limited scope and is really unhelpful. And instead, I think design and research can become something that helps us explore this much wider context and this much wider set of relationships. And I've also been talking a lot about the sort of human-centered part of this, but obviously that's not it, right? To create a well-rounded product, there's often many, well, actually often quite competing, really, forces at play and things that pull us in different directions. So yes, we have to think about how this affects humans and society, but also we have to think about users, we have to think about our organization and what's technically possible, what data is available, and so on. And this will look different for you as well, depending on what you're working on and what your organization is. But I'm sure we all recognize these forces or some version of this in our world. If you have been keeping up with the latest kind of developments in AI, certainly in the past few months, there's been a lot of new developments, a lot of hype, dare I say, around, say, DALL-E or ChatGPT. And I think it's been even as people that are relatively close to the field, kind of incredible to see, and also surprising to see just how much is possible. And all of that, I think, centers around this part, right? Like, we're just pushing the boundaries of what is possible, and we're just using what's available to us to try and achieve new, different, cool things, really. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I actually also really believe in that as a source of innovation and as a source of opportunity, but that can't be it, right? We can't like stop there. We have to think about these other forces and try to reconcile some of these other forces and actually work within these creative tensions to make sure that we're creating something that is considered and well-rounded. So some examples of the kind of considerations that we have to bring, I think, that can be powered by research and be powered by design. A really common refrain in the AI space, maybe you've come across this, is that AI is going to help us with our low-value tasks. I think I actually do agree with part of the sentiment because it suggests a partnership between humans and AI, and I think that's a really appropriate way to think about it. But if you actually pause and think on this sentiment a little longer, you kind of start to ask questions like, okay, value. What kind of value? Like functional, emotional, financial, probably. And also low value according to who? According to the person that's doing the task, the person that maybe is suffering from the problems. So what is high value to one person in one context may not be in another. And a really mundane example of this is if I was, say, packing up my belongings and wrapping up my things because I needed to move house, that for me is an activity I would love to outsource, right? It's tedious. I am very happy to have that be, automated or to have assistance with that task. But say wrapping gifts for loved ones for the holidays, that's a very different, even though it's functionally a very similar task, is actually something that I might take a lot of joy in. And that's also very personal to me. So this might be, both of these might be equally tedious to somebody else altogether. And that was like a silly example, but you can see how this manifests in the real world when we use AI systems in the real world and we center a very particular type of value. So what a business stakeholder who's, say, several degrees removed from the task at hand thinks is high value or low value might be in odds or in tension with what the person actually doing that work values. And I think it's really also very easy to see how these things come about. It's not like there is some, mastermind at work coming up with like terrible ideas on purpose. I can completely see a world in which someone just says, hey, we need to make sure that our warehouses are efficient. We need to make sure that our employees are performing. And that's also completely reasonable to expect in a commercial enterprise. But I think the problem becomes when we only center that worldview and that set of values and don't try to reconcile it with alternate points of view. And again, these are the kinds of things that show up in the headlines. They are the more kind of visible things that we see, but things don't have to fail catastrophically for us to pay attention to them or for them to be bad outcomes for our work. It can also just manifest as, like a lack of adoption or lack of engagement or just creating things that are not quite as useful as they could be ultimately. And again, commonly we talk a lot about these negative scenarios. I'm actually not trying to be a downer about this at all. I also really believe that creating or working with these kind of creative tensions and creating these well-rounded products, that's also a way for us to think about brand new opportunities, to think about things that we maybe hadn't considered possible. So I think there's a lot of upside in all of this as well. One other area that I think research and design can really help with is in reducing risk and ambiguity. So deploying AI systems is complex, it's risky, it's often a long journey. And design and research, the tools, the mindsets, the kind of methods that we can bring to the table can actually really help reduce some of that risk. And that can happen, again, not just at the point of designing the actual experience, but actually all the way from the outset. So doing things, for instance, like Wizard of Oz, like prototyping, to actually understand, say, what level of accuracy or detail is even valuable before going in and doing all of the actual work to model and create that desired outcome, is a really easy way to actually make sure you're kind of conserving your energy or putting your chips in the right places. So one very practical way that we do this in our work is called a feasibility study. Quite often, obviously, it depends on where customers are in their journey, but they'll come to us with a hunch, like a sort of a broad hypothesis, let's say, that they've got some data and they want to achieve some sort of outcome, and they believe that if we introduce machine learning into the mix, that will help. It'll make things better. It'll make things faster. And in order to both actually improve our understanding of the problem, but also to make sure that what we're about to embark on is kind of broadly doable and makes sense, we run this sprint of work called a feasibility study. And that involves a data scientist or two looking at the data that's actually available, right? And understanding where it came from, whether it's appropriate for the kind of thing that we're thinking about using it for, and just having a very preliminary exploration on what kinds of things might be gleaned from it. And then on the other hand, researchers and designers exploring both this desired outcome. So I'm sure you're all familiar, this tends to be pretty broad and vague at the early stages of something. So making something, say, faster or better or more effective. So we dig a little deeper into that idea and try to unpick it a bit and understand what that actually means in their context, but also exploring the general problem and opportunity context. So who are the people that have a stake in this system, literal stakeholders, what are their values, what are they looking for, and so on. And also doing that in a way that is always in constant dialogue and collaboration, so that we're making sure that we're creating something that is both possible with the data, but also desirable and useful for the actual context. And what that means is that, and again, gross oversimplification, obviously, of the actual outcome of this kind of process, but what might happen as a result of this is that we might reframe the original hypothesis or hunch that came from the customer and find that perhaps it was kind of useful, kind of doable, but actually we found things that are maybe more valuable that could be done with that same data, or maybe things that were in the data that they didn't realize were in the data that could be used to address the same opportunity. So it helps us essentially to reframe potentially, but also to just align on what it is that we're doing and to reduce any risk before we go into any kind of actual, modeling or any kind of complex, more risky activity. So in my mind, research and design, the role of that can exist throughout the life cycle or different kind of altitudes of the product, essentially. So around finding the actual right opportunity and reframing it, around refining the actual product proposition. So what does it actually do and for who? And then eventually actually designing the experience. So how should it be doing the job and how should it be behaving? And on this note of designing the experience appropriately, it also requires us, working with AI, requires us to also rethink what good means. And I'm saying us, I also mean that for designers. I think there's a lot of, let's call it design gospel, or ideas about what good design is that get challenged when we work with AI systems, which, as I've said, can be harder to kind of anticipate or can be more prone to failure. So we might have told ourselves historically that good design is consistent and it's reliable. But as you can see in this example, and as I'm sure you've all encountered in your use of digital products, there can be instances where it fails, right? And in this case, it's failed in a vaguely amusing way. You could take a screenshot, you stick it on Reddit, we all laugh. Great. But if this keeps happening, obviously, over and over again, or if this keeps happening, not in a scenario where it's an email and I can scroll past it, but it's a sort of mission critical exercise or it's very high stakes, then we have a more fundamental sort of problem. So really then good design becomes more about determining the acceptable amount of failure. So is there maybe a context or a scenario in which failure is unacceptable, in which case maybe we shouldn't use it in that setting, or we should figure out the extent to which it might fail and kind of move forward accordingly. Another common refrain, I think, is this idea of trust and good design building trust. We also think about trust as like a net positive, I think. So we're trying to always engender trust from our users and get them to sort of lean on us and rely on our work as much as possible. But actually, when it comes to AI systems that can fail, that's not always desirable. So automation bias is a thing when we're presented with systems, especially ones that are called artificial intelligence, right? And we don't quite understand what that means. We're much more inclined to actually listen and take on their suggestions and to rely on those systems than our own, reasoning and our own five senses. So these are three separate cars that drove into three separate lakes on three separate occasions because they were following their navigation over and above what they were actually seeing and their own kind of judgment. And again, this is, well, probably wasn't funny for the people that own these cars or drove these cars, but, makes for a headline that we kind of chuckle at and we forward to our friends. But when we imagine systems like this in higher stakes contexts, then it becomes less amusing and more problematic. So then again, good design becomes much more about us communicating the kind of limitations of the system or potentially the reasoning for what it's saying so that humans can ultimately decide whether and how and in what context to actually trust that information. And finally, again, very common phrase that we throw around is, design makes things frictionless, makes things easy. I'm sure you've seen lots of stories like this as well. So given, again, that AI systems can't always understand or contextualize what we're saying or can make mistakes and can fail, it becomes then less about removing that friction altogether and more about encouraging appropriate control and respecting human goals and values. So those are a very high level sort of thematic set of things we're thinking about. This is a short ad break. No, I'm kidding. This is actually really great. I wouldn't be talking about this if I didn't genuinely use it. We have a human AI experience toolkit at Microsoft, which actually has a set of guidelines and patterns and examples that you can work through if you are working on an AI product or feature that help guide your efforts to make sure that it's basically behaving appropriately and partnering appropriately with humans. And it goes into a lot more granular detail around some of these themes. And finally, designing AI also requires rethinking how we work. So I think implicit in all of the stuff that I've just shared is not that it's just about design and research, but that it's about showing up in a particular way and thinking about AI products in a particular way and doing so in a way that cuts across disciplines. And when we are trying to kind of reconcile these different perspectives and these different forces, it's really important for us to be mindful of how we're actually, showing up as a team or how we're actually designing our processes as well. So we need to make sure that these concerns can be adequately kind of represented, but also that we, to some extent, are breaking down some of the barriers between our disciplines as well. So just because we don't have a user researcher in the room, it doesn't mean we get to throw that consideration out the window, because as we can see, that's a very easy way to create this kind of skew and start potentially causing harm or creating things that are not really valuable. So that requires us to think about a number of areas. One is around structures and around representation. So you may be familiar with Conway's law, but ultimately, whatever we design, the systems that we create mirror the structures and the teams that we work in. So knowing that, how can we actually almost flip that on its head and show up to work on AI products in a way that reflects how we want those products to be? So say we're saying we want this product to be human-centered. If there's nobody who is responsible for actually learning, understanding that, and advocating for that in your team, then how can you actually be sure that that's going to happen at all? And how do you make sure that you're not introducing any kind of bias into your process? A really clear example of this is when we work in areas where there's a lot of kind of embedded expertise and subject matter knowledge, say in healthcare. It's really important for us to make sure that we actually bring those expert voices into our process, regardless of what we're working on, because it can become quite easy, I think, to go down a bit of a slippery slope, that when we understand, the specifications of what we're doing, that we maybe get a little bit blinkered by that and we just drive to delivering on that thing. But actually, it's really important for us to continue to keep those voices involved in the process of developing these products. And extending from that, also how we think about our language, our rituals, and our artifacts. So how we think about how we've defined success. If that's about how the system performs technically, or about the business value that it generates, then is that really a shared value or shared idea of value, a shared idea of success? Or is it going to be a really easy way for us to, again, set ourselves down a sort of skewed path? How do we also create the right communication and the right boundary objects? So yes, we can invite the right people to the table, so to speak, the proverbial table, or have them in the room. But if we have all of that representation, but the conversation that we're having is still a technical one, then is that really a collaborative and participatory process? So how do we create common language, common ways of working that everyone can feel kind of invited to and included in, so that we actually shape these systems together? And also the pace and the cycles of work. So quite common in our world, I work in an engineering organization, so we're very used to the dynamic of very quickly getting to a definition of what it is that we're trying to create, breaking that down into small, units that we can deliver, and then getting started on that delivery, which doesn't always create the right kind of space or dynamic for some of the consideration and some of the creative tension that we talked about earlier. So it's really important, again, that we make sure that the values that we have in, say, trying to create something that is human-centered actually align, all the way down through how we show up to do the work, and we're not creating a bit of a square peg, round hole situation. And the other thing that's implicit, I think, in all of this is that it requires us to anticipate future harm. That sounds a little bit, well, it sounds simple, actually, but I don't think it is at all. In a context where we are usually incentivized to just do stuff, to keep moving forward, to deliver things on time, and so on, it becomes really easy for us to get used to just suspending our disbelief almost, and just believing that what we're doing is the right thing to do and just working to achieve that. But actually, it's really important for us to deliberately create space to consider how things might fail, so that then we can design those things out, design out that potential. And that requires, I think, the deliberate creation of those safe spaces. So doing things, for instance, like pre-mortems that allow us to actually safely air some of those concerns, safely share some of those concerns, so we have the right language and also the right kind of safety, actually, in our teams to be able to raise those concerns as and when they come up. So I think this last chapter isn't necessarily, there isn't like a kind of easy fix to much of these things, but it's much more about, some of the rituals or processes and things that we put in place, but also just about how we all show up every day to this process, how we all show up as, practitioners. And it's much more about the mindsets that we bring and being aware of our biases. So the humility to basically say, what are the biases that I maybe bring to this? What's my agenda, and what might I be kind of pushing towards? The awareness to actually ask who's not in the room. I'm here, I'm representing my view, but maybe what else should be represented that isn't here? And also the curiosity to explore alternate points of view, even when we think we've reached a good decision, to continue to challenge ourselves with, who might disagree, what might be an alternate view, a disagreeing view on this, so that I can maybe learn from that or challenge myself to consider those other perspectives. So with that, I want to leave you with some things that you can do next. There's a lot of existing tools and resources, some of which I mentioned already in this talk, that I would encourage you to explore. If you maybe don't work with AI quite as much yet, or haven't had as much exposure, then I really encourage you to explore some of the key concepts and principles and actually play around with what's out there. I will say it's not necessarily representative of the full world of AI, but it is super cool. And if you do already work with AI or have worked with AI features in the past, I really encourage you to reflect on some of your own ways of working. So where are maybe areas in which research and design could do more for you, and how can you foster better collaboration in your team and in your work? That's it. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments.
Thank you very much. That was really great. We unfortunately we don't have time for questions, but I have written down about 5 or 6, and I've just seen that Joe has asked if you can put the links that you just had up on that slide into the chat.
Yep.
So what I'll do is I'll connect with you after this, and we'll put the questions that I had up on our Ask the Speakers channel, because there's just so much into my mind, particularly around in the last year, my definition of feasible flipped, because I thought image generation and ChatGPT are not feasible. Whereas now, if that's feasible, what else can we do? So there's just some of those kind of really interesting kind of things that I'd love to get more insight from you. But I'm really sorry. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today, but I will post those in the Slack channel, and I'll invite you to it shortly.
Yes, happy to take it offline.
Great. So thank you very much, Esra. But now, up next, we have Silvia. And Silvia will be talking about value-based selling for the UX-centric enterprise. So without further ado, welcome, Silvia. Okay, there appears to be a problem.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now perfectly.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I could hear some noise in the background, so it's fine. You can hear my voice.
Yeah, you're working perfectly. For some reason, the screen for me is blank. I'm just going to turn it off and try reshare again. For some reason, I can see you and hear you perfectly, but the screen isn't showing.
Oh, I can see I'm sharing actually. So
yeah, it looks fine from your side. There we go. Don't know what triggered it.
No, I'm actually sharing. Can you see it now? Because now I'm projecting kind of. So now I got widescreen, so I don't know if you see.
No, I'm still seeing the unshared version. It looks like there might be a issue. What we'll do is I'll just try. Could you, I know this is really strange, try to refresh and I'll add you back in, and hopefully that will solve the problem. If that doesn't solve the problem, we'll look at it.
Yeah. Would you like to do another, can I do another try, and then maybe it's absolutely useless? Because I was sharing a window, I'm trying to share a screen, and just tell me if it's the same problem.
Okay.
Is it the same problem?
Yeah, unfortunately, it looks like it's the same problem.
Okay. So
it popped up there. So maybe actually, could you share one more time? Just present one more time, and we'll just see. Maybe hope.
Yeah, that's
okay. It actually seems like it's working now. So I'll drop off. I'll let you present, and if there is any issues, I'll jump back in, and we can try another option.
okay.
So over to you, Silvia. Thank you very
much. So, as I said, what I although this is not the only reason why I would like to share my thoughts on it today, I think it's also important to discuss this from a strategy, innovation, and design perspective. And I also want to kind of show what we are doing in IBM client engineering and how we are using the principles of this approach to kind of foster the innovation journey of our clients, and also to promote more user-centric solutions and better experiences. So it makes sense to start from defining what value-based selling actually is. Starting from a definition of value that kind of caught my attention. This is from Seth Godin's blog, the famous marketing guru, which reminds us that value is not the price, is it? Or is not just the price on an item. So two items that retail with a different price might have cost the same to produce. But even if we know that, we are still willing to pay for that price difference. And if you're not into wine, I think the metaphor applies to literally anything. And the reason why you're willing to pay for that price difference lies in something bigger. And that something bigger is what the product does for you. And this is exactly what you want to demonstrate when you play around with value-based selling. So value-based selling really articulates this idea about sales as being broader than just shipping a product, and more about co-creating a solution with customers. The backdrop of this is that there's been a shift over the last decades from seeing sales as primarily as a product or supply-centric process to focusing much more seriously on the customer. So I'm going to give you a brief and very simplistic overview of the evolution of the sales epistemology. So in the past decades, it was primarily all about feature selling, and that was kind of ideal because there would always be a straightforward way to map a product capability to a specific business problem. But as problems became more complex and competition kept growing around the same very products, we reached a point where companies started to sprint away from product and feature selling and embrace solution selling, whereby they would create different versions of products for different needs. So they would basically try to cater for different customer segments. And that really took off during the 80s, and particularly with companies who had highly customized products or would sell packages, mobile companies, for instance, but also IT companies who would provide additional services, say maintenance or security, on top of their existing platforms. Those would likely provide bundles for each of the different customers. And actually, this led to product differentiation and to design more sophisticated kind of products that actually would fit into a differentiation leadership kind of strategy. But with competition ever growing, and also with a customer base that was becoming more intelligent, and I will come back to this concept shortly, we reached a point where competing just on differentiation was still necessary, but not sufficient to secure a deal. And this is the point where we started to put an emphasis on this concept of value in the sales setting. At first, as a kind of generic value selling, whereby sellers will provide buyers with very generic examples of the value that would accrue to other organizations through the use of their solutions. So it's something that was really kind of convenient from a sales rep's perspective, because they would just whisk out a preset success story to kind of show the value of their solutions. But soon they realized that this kind of approach was a little bit too generic, too wishy-washy, and it would never persuade customers to kind of buy the products or buy into the products. And so this is the point where we started to talk about more specific or differentiated methodologies for value-based selling. And this is the point where we are today. So value-based selling really is an approach to sales that really focuses on how a product or a service provides value to a customer, rather than focusing just on price, on products features. And what is it that qualifies value-based selling? There is this strong focus on customer needs. So we are still in solution selling realm. So we are still in this kind of customization kind of domain. There is a quantification of the value, and this is very distinctive of value-based selling, because as in the previous talk we touched upon this point, value can be is a mouthful of a word, and it can be really difficult to kind of pinpoint to specific something. But if you're able to prove the value of your solution in terms of higher efficiency or increased revenues or employee retention or customer satisfaction, then you put a number behind these vague words. And this is what value sellers do. They quantify that value. They just put a number by it and against a specific business problem. This is important because actually in this way, by quantifying, by putting a number, you are able to better communicate the reason why customers should buy into your solution. And at the same time, customers are really able to understand what is the impact on the business model, on the business problem, on the ecosystem. And crucially, they can do that before committing financially to a particular solution. So there is also this de-risking kind of element, which is kind of appealing for them. Conversations in value-based selling are quite particular and are different from the typical sales conversation because they're far more engaging and far more interactive. And also, sellers are taking on a more consultative approach. They're really striving to guide the customers into taking informed decisions, which ideally, of course, should lead also to the purchase of a particular solution. Why now? Why do we need a new way of selling, first of all, and why now in particular? So there are the backdrop to all of these is that something has changed in the sales world, and there are several challenges, and primarily they concern the sales teams. And I don't want to talk about unprecedented challenges, but of course, sales teams today are facing challenges that are tougher than in the past. Global uncertainties such as the COVID-19 crisis, wars, inflation, other cyclical crises unfurling in our economy are really ushered in a new era of customer caution. So companies are making only the most essential expenditures. There's high level of financial scrutiny, and this is making things tougher for sellers. But also there is a process which started with the advent of the internet, and which is sort of magnified today, whereby easy access to information has kind of shifted the balance of power from the seller to the customer. In the past, customer would just pick up the phone, call a company and ask to speak to a sales rep. But since the advent of the internet, that concept has been literally turned on its head. So now customers can really have information on products. They can request demo, they can read other people's opinions, they can look at different use cases on the web. So really the balance of power has shifted, and customers are typically entering the sales process much more knowledgeable and much more opinionated about a particular product. 77% of buyers say they contact a salesperson only after have carried out the due diligence, their own research on a particular product. And this is making things a little bit tougher for sellers. And on top of that, and amidst increasing pressures to reduce cost, there is also this a mounting skepticism around generic promises of product performances, and companies are asking more and more a tangible proof of the value of these solutions. But I think that by far the most important element that makes the case for value-based selling goes beyond sales actually, and is about the increasing complexity of the business problem space. Which as a result has an impact on the sales setting, as I said, because companies today are facing really tough challenges and what we call wicked problems. So problems that are ill-defined, ill-formulated, where there's lots of confusion, lots of ambiguity, there's a plethora of stakeholders, no one is really talking with the other, no one is really understanding what the other has to say, and crucially where you don't see the impact, the long-term impact on your solution, on your ecosystem, how it's trickling down on your employees, your customers, all your systems. So you don't see the long-term effect on your innovation roadmap. Those are the wicked problems. And companies are really asking sometimes salespeople to kind of understand these problems and to account for them, which is really, really difficult for them to do. So this is the backdrop of the storm that sales teams are called to weather. And really value-based selling is, we can define it as the last incarnation of solution selling, but in an era of increased competition and increased complexity. And the promise of value-based selling really is to, the sales argument is not anymore, I've got a specific product for your specific need, but it's more about, with my solution, you're going to achieve X and Y. I'm going to measure this value. I'm going to measure this value against your very problem. And this is good from both sides, because it is easily, for customers can relate, can understand when a solution relates to their particular problem. They can understand the impact, and also is, for them, is de-risking, because they can actually understand that before committing financially to a particular solution. One key element of value-based selling is really co-creation. This is key, and methodology-wise is what really sets value-based selling apart from other types of sales. And it's really about involving customers into the creation of this value, into a creation of a solution. And actually what co-creation is all about is an exchange of resources among different actors. So actors interact together, and they do share resources, they integrate other actors' resources, and they crucially do create also other resources along the way, along a learning process, a kind of learning process. And that's really key. And also co-creation actually has another benefit, because it kind of creates engagement around the sales process. So it creates an experience around this process, and this is really important, because, and I'm still stealing from Seth Godin's blog here, the price of an item is obvious. It can be seen from a mile away, but value is more subtle, and it often needs to be experienced to be understood. So what value-based selling says is, if you are able to tangibly show what they stand to gain from a particular solution, how it's going to impact the business model, the business problems, you are framing an intriguing value propositions that your prospects, your clients are going to be receptive to. Now, I want to investigate more the relationship between value-based selling and design thinking, because I'm assuming that most of you tuning in today are designers, and we touched upon some things that might sound incredibly familiar to you: wicked problems, user centricity, and co-creation. And actually, I would argue that design thinking not only resonates with the value-based selling scenario, but can actually elevate it into a real path to innovation, and a path to innovation to the design of better experiences and more user-centric experiences. This is the high-level process for value-based selling, and you can see how it is tremendously adhering to the high steps, the high-level steps of the design thinking framework. So there is an understanding, there is an exploration kind of part, there is a problem definition kind of phase, and then we go the prototyping, the solution, the making phase, when we do create those artifacts that kind of make the value feasible and make the solution visible, and make the solution kind of tangible. So this is really, understanding problem statement and creating. And this is a framework, and I like to think of frameworks as of recipes. Any framework, that could be a strategy framework, a marketing framework, and recipes. You've got a recipe of an apple pie, and all your ingredients are there. But then, if you use your ingredients in a different way, you might create a recipe which is still an apple pie, but it better suits your liking. And also frameworks work like that, in my opinion. And this is actually the high-level framework for this is the take on this recipe that we have in client engineering team in IBM. This is the high-level framework, and we call it the value engineering framework, that we use in IBM to kind of break the wicked problems down and co-create with customers the solution to specific problems that we do identify. This is a very simplified version. Actually, the model is much more articulated, because there's lots of engagement along the way, but actually it can be roughly halved into two. There is an innovate phase where we do understand what the problem is. We do a full body scan of actually what the business problem is from a user-centric perspective. So we really understand what are the business needs and the user needs, and we connect the two. And then we define a business opportunity that we want to focus on, and then there is a co-creation phase where we actually work with the client in a sort of agile, iterative way to kind of create a solution that can prove the value of the technology applied to a specific business problem. And crucially, what we do in the co-creation phase, we measure the user value that ensures once the features and the ideas that have been presented in the innovate phase are pushed into production. And the double diamond is there because what we really do is to open and close. So there is an exploratory phase, so we do research, and then we close down, we converge on a business opportunity, and then again we open up again because we explore different things, we iterate with the client, and then we converge again on the MVP, which is the minimum viable part of the solution we are going to design, which is how the product should look like at the end. And it's worth noticing that this kind of process this kind of framework is very, I should say, unusual or counterintuitive in a sales setting where traditionally, the process has been always represented as a straight line, or I should say as a funnel. So progressively narrowing down to the closure of the deal. But actually in this case, it's completely different. So it's a completely alternative approach to sales that kind of supports sales in a way. I would like to dig a little bit deeper into the role of designers into these. So during the innovation phase, we do, it's really a twofold kind of job, because we do have a more strategic role in the innovate phase where we do research and where we do facilitate. And that's really important, because actually what we do in these engagements that we have with the clients, we do work in multidisciplinary teams because projects are so complex that we actually need to reach out to different experts. And so our teams are very compact, but we actually reach out to different experts because it's really important to have in the room all the disciplines and all the specialisms that are required to kind of break down those wicked problems. And one really important role that we designers have in this multidisciplinary team is actually that of connector, of bridge. So we bridge different specialism, and there's an analogy which is beautiful by Victor Papanek, the famous designer, and he used to say design is a kind of Esperanto language, and this is actually what we can do. What we can do at our best is connecting different languages, connecting different specialism in the room. And then this is the innovate phase. In the co-creation phase, that's the making, and this is where we build those artifacts, we build blueprints, MVPs, prototypes, or something completely different. That could be a conversational AI, so that could be the content for the conversational AI, so something that has a tangible kind of outcome. So far so good, because we touched upon the theory of value-based selling, how he's promising from a sales perspective, but also from an innovation perspective, particularly when paired with design thinking, which is what we do in IBM. But when it comes to implement this kind of approach, value-based selling, that's a different story, because companies, we are seeing that really learning value-based selling the hard way, and many have only really started to understand the value of things like co-creation or understanding customer needs. So it's quite difficult, despite the bountiful opportunities that this approach brings. It's very difficult to operationalize. And I stumbled upon several studies on the subject, and they all point out to some key challenges for the sales teams to implement this kind of approach. The first is to demonstrate the impact of the solution in the short time frame of a sales process, because we are in the sales process to all intents and purposes. A second challenge lies in the a reluctance or a resistance of sales teams themselves, because as this process tends to be longer than a usual sales process, it might be tedious for sales people who are in a rush or do have tight targets to meet. A third element is around finding quantifiable value elements. So in some projects, it might be difficult to find elements that you can measure the value on. And the third challenge is actually engaging the customer in co-creation. So buying the commitment to share those resources. As I said, co-creation is about sharing resources. So sometimes customers will be reluctant to do so, primarily because they don't know you, they don't trust you, they might share resources that are sensitive, that are actually proprietary. So you need to find a way to build that trust. And I think the answer to these challenges lies in a massive cultural change within organizations, which has to happen at multiple levels. And I tried to jot down a framework for that. The first change that needs to happen at the sales teams level, and there needs to be the sales teams really need to shun the path of least resistance, meaning that when there is a pressure to close the deal, it's all too easy to skip that research, to skip that full body scan of the business opportunity and of users' needs. And it's very easy to default, searching for information about how to frame a problem from a single source of truth. That could be the CRM, that could be the internet, but this often results in a very partial and one-dimensional view of the customer, of the prospect, and of the problems they are trying to solve. So it's really important that we ingrain that kind of value-based culture into sales teams, and this comes down also to there needs to be a rethinking of how the sales process works, and also of the structures around the sales process. So primarily how salespeople are measured. So what are the metrics of value performance? These needs to be tweaked in order to accommodate for value-based selling kind of practices. A second point is actually a second point that needs to change is promoting an understanding of design thinking within the sales teams and the leadership teams. The message that has to pass is that design thinking is a solution-based approach to solving problems, and it combines desirability from a human perspective with technology feasibility and with economic viability. And for that reason, it really helps solve problems that are not conventionally associated to design. And I always like to refer to this framework. This is Richard Buchanan, the co-author of Design, and it really shows how design really encompasses everything that goes from the physical to the intangible, touching upon processes and systems. And this is really what we need to kind of nail down at every level of organizations to really make them understand that design thinking is much more used and is increasingly successfully used also in innovation and in strategic context. And in that respect, I would like to highlight something, because design thinking works in a particular way, which is more abductive, and this has a profound impact on sales strategy when you apply it. So traditionally, there are two strategies. One in the sales, regarding sales. One is a more a kind of deductive kind of strategy or push strategy, whereby the supplier kind of assumes what customer needs are, and so they provide an optimal solution. And that was the case of technical sales, or feature selling. Another kind of approach is an inductive kind of sales, which is more a pull sales, where you basically ask your customer, what is it that you need? And your customers say you what they assume they need. But value-based selling says, no, we both know what the needs are, or what the needs that we should focus on are, what is the best opportunity that we should pursue, and therefore we are going to sit together, we are going to frame this opportunity together, and we're going to co-create a solution. So it's not deductive, it's not inductive, it's an abductive kind of approach. So it's based on hypotheses and validation of those hypotheses, and this is precisely how also design thinking works. So how design thinking can really tweak the sales process. And it's really important also to send the message to the sales teams that it doesn't have to be value-based selling all the time, because sometimes problems are really well defined. They're not wicked problems, so you might resort to either of the first two approaches. In some cases, that might be just you use a deductive kind of approach, a push kind of approach, or an inductive kind of approach. But in some other cases, value-based selling, particularly when you have to deal with wicked problems, it is particularly helpful and is particularly meaningful also. Another change that needs to happen is actually making sure that everyone in organizations, both buyers and sellers, understand what user centricity really is. And it's actually really fascinating to see in every engagement that we're going to have that the best business opportunities and the most pressing business needs always invariably comes down to addressing a user's need. And actually, I think this concept of user centricity is really well captured by in this quote by legend Vivienne Westwood. Sadly, she left us weeks ago. This is from a very old interview where she was kind of commenting on the apparent decline of haute culture in the 90s, and she famously bemoaned fashion houses because they don't design with a woman's body in mind. They spend a fortune on prototypes that actually can't be worn by anyone. It's just the idea of a beautiful product. But luckily, there are still a few, and she actually appointed herself to be one of those few who still care to design something that when a woman wears it and walks down the street, nobody will look more wonderful than that woman. And I think this is the key message is that you really need to design stuff that will benefit the life of someone and the work of someone along the line, at some point along the line. Actually, one of the difficult sometimes in communicate the value of a user-centric culture is to really to define this word user, because sometimes we tend to think of user in terms of the end user, so the one who pushes buttons on an interface, or the one who, or the end users in end market. And actually, in an IT setting, for instance, or in a B2B kind of scenario, it might be more difficult to identify what the user actually is, particularly in the IT world. That sometimes you just have agents, you have systems that are benefited by a particular solution. But actually, what's important to communicate is that whatever you do, however solution you implement, there's always someone being benefited along the way at some point in the process. There's always someone pushing those applications, pushing those systems, and your value proposition needs to be tweaked around that. This is also important also to think in kind of human terms, to kind of scope down what you want to do into an MVP, because you're going to measure that MVP in terms of the benefit accrued to a real user when your solution is in production. And one last point is about this MVP and scoping down to the MVP, because actually, as I said, you don't have 6 months to carry out a project. In a value-based selling scenario, you are still in a selling kind of a process, so you really need to close the deal. So, and you might have 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or some weeks to kind of close the deal. So what you need to do is to actually scope down on something that it's enough to kind of show the value, but at the same time has the power to really make you envision what could be a future roadmap. So what could be a solution in the future, and what could be the implication on your ecosystem, and how can you scale up from this small portion, from this small bite of the cake, what could be the cake in the future. So what's going to be your innovation journey in the future, starting from this small experiment, so to speak. And so just to wrap up, value-based selling can be a transformative approach to sales, particularly when paired with design thinking, and can really transform the sales process into a path to innovation, which is grounded and rooted in users' needs and in the value that accrues to users. And it really allows all parties to envision future ecosystems. And at the same time, it really also allows for companies to implement these agile experiments that are really fit into this space and time, whereas this, the time to market and the pace of innovation, all of these, this is really tough for companies now. And value-based selling really proves to be a way also for them to effectively try out new solutions and experiment, and then with the mindset that everything is a prototype, nothing is never really done, and you can always improve along the way. And it's absolutely, from a designer's perspective, this is absolutely one of the most interesting spaces to be in at the moment. Thank you for listening me, and apologies for the glitches that we had earlier. And thank you. I'm curious to hear if there are questions or comments around this topic. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. No, that is actually, it's a topic that I'm really, really massively interested in, because I do think it's a better way of working, and I have so many questions of how does it actually work in practice. But before I jump into my questions, there was a question from Mihaela who asked, can you expand a bit on the perfect design solution for that need, which was seen in phase 2 of the workflow diagram? And I think what it was you were talking about your kind of design thinking, where you're trying to, you come up with a wicked problem, and then you need to experiment and kind of get the empathy and understand what that solution could be.
Yeah, I didn't quite catch the first part of the question. What page are you referring to?
It was phase 2 of the workflow diagram.
Oh, yeah.
And the question was, can you expand a bit on the perfect design solution for that need?
Yeah. So that's really, when I said that value-based selling is the last incarnation of solution selling, because actually what you do, you really start from what the needs are of the business. But actually what you want to do is to kind of find out what is the best business opportunity to pursue. And the best business opportunity usually is always related to some sort of user need. And the best solution that you can develop is something that kind of meets the business need and users need in the middle, and it really allows you to ground that design into into an improvement of a human condition. In a way, that could be an employee, that could be a customer, that could be a third party, a stakeholder. But by doing so, you're really able to make it concrete in a way, make it tangible, and you can measure it in a way. You can put numbers behind it, so it's more concrete. I don't know if that answered your question, but actually, it really comes down when you do have a wicked problem. You really need to break it down and always kind of take it down to the user need. And what you do, because you might have a plethora of user needs, you need to prioritize. And that's an activity that you do with your customers. Particularly, as I said, if you want to develop something small, something that you can scale. So that's a good idea. What we do usually, we do prioritize, and we say, this is what we are doing, the MVP, this is what is taken, this is a future goal. So it's really important because you really need to keep an eye also on what you do. You really need to prove something in a short time frame, because you are in a sales process. So you really need to understand what are the most urgent needs that I want to solve. So you prioritize needs or pain points depending on the angle you want to frame it.
Great. I hope, Mihaela, that's answered your question. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We're slightly over, but we had some technical issues, so I let it run a little bit late. But thank you very much, Silvia. I really enjoyed that. I do have a few more questions that I'll post into the Slack channel, and hopefully you've been invited there, so hopefully you'll be able to join us and answer those.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end for today. I hope you enjoyed that session. This was kind of a short introduction to the kind of topics that we discuss at our conferences. And wouldn't you know it, we have one coming up in May. So we'll be in New York, in the USA. You can also join us online. So we'll be having 25 speakers, 8 workshops. There'll be about 800 people there. We had a fantastic time there last year. So really hoping to recreate the atmosphere and the mood, and meeting all those amazing people again. So please do, if you did enjoy that, please do look at our site and come along. But that brings us to the end for today. We did have originally scheduled another speaker, Dan Cork, but unfortunately he is down with the flu, just like I think half the people I know. So we will reschedule Dan for a future date. So apologies if you were waiting around to hear from Dan. But we'll reschedule him when he's feeling a little bit better. All right, that brings us to the end. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you again soon.